Hi. So this morning I'm going to do the second half of my love-hate debate with Jessica Flowers, where I'm talking about Shirley Temple as the mythological hero, feminist icon, and 6-year-old, how Hollywood turned a child into a mock superhero, a sexual object, and a symbol that repeats itself through media history. And before I get really specifically into Shirley, let's go through the definition of mythology theory, which was written by Roland Brothers in the 1950s. It is your really typical hero-villain story, where the hero is honest, truthful, physically attractive, strong, vulnerable, etc. And the villain is the opposite. It's people like your Captain Americas, your Katniss Everdeen's, and even your Frodo Baggins. He's a hero, or she is a hero, who is beaten against all odds and prevails in the end. And Shirley Temple's stories are written in that very typical hero kind of way, where, she is an orphan. She's at the very bottom, and against all odds, she comes out on top and is adopted. And I think she's marketed and sort of has this veil of hero that's sort of put over her. When in fact, I do not believe that that is the truth. Upon further inspection, it becomes really clear that Shirley is not the hero within her story. She is just the hero that is marketed for her story. So Shirley Temple, like I said, is an orphan or a godchild. She has nothing. She has nothing that is her own. She has nothing to call hers. And she uses what she has, which is her charm, her virginal innocence, and her overwhelming positivity, to get what she needs at the end. But at the end, she's always made to need a hero. It's not like she uses what she has and then saves herself. She's made to need someone. Enter her male co-stars, who adopts or saves Shirley at the end. They always are of wealth or importance. They are extremely possessive over her and assert themselves, himself specifically, into her life, whether it be her living with him helping her through some tragedy, or him marrying her older, also orphaned sister, like in Curly Top. So, Shirley is sort of made to be the hero's symbol, but the true hero is always her male counterpart. And I think that that was done sort of to appeal to the people during the Depression, using Code's theory by Sesher in 1916, where text, images, behaviors, and etc. that create a message. I think it's an interesting message that is presented in Shirley Temple's movies, where, use what you have to your advantage. Shirley uses her charm, her ability to, work with men, her dance moves, and youth is your way out. Where people, like all the men in all of her stories, fall practically in love with Shirley Temple because of her charm, her cuteness, her innocence. She knows how to get them. But I think the main message of all the stories, which I think is most interesting considering it was the Great Depression, was that the rich will save you. And this was a time when people were desperate financially. And I just think it's really interesting to say, hard work won't save you, or anything like earning your own money, but that rich people will swoop in and save you if you know how to use them to your advantage, and if you're beautiful enough for it. I just think that's very interesting. So the next definition that I have is feminism, a political project that explores the way men and women are socially empowered and disempowered. Flapper, a fashionable woman intent on enjoying herself and flouting conventional standards of behavior, and pedophilia, the deriving of sexual gratification from sexual fantasies or acts involving a child. My debate partner had mentioned Baby Burlesque, which was a set of films that Shirley Temple did, where children were sort of portraying adults in adult situations like prostitution, etc. She said that it was, them portraying adults, and that it was coming off the Roaring 20s because it was in the early 30s, And it was just a sign of the times. It was what was popular, it was what was sold, and that's just the way that it is. But seeing these definitions and then seeing baby burlesque itself, I think it's really clear that these flappers were grown, consenting adults who were women who had their own sexual agency, their own ideas for what they wanted to do with their body, and they had control. And over here to the left, you have Shirley Temple, who was told, get down on the floor and look up at me like this, put your hand on your hip and on your head like that, put in these little outfits on purpose. It's just a difference between portraying an adult, being 3 years old, and being an adult, i.e. a consenting woman. I think it plays a lot into gender stereotypes, but also, like, this is pedophilia. Getting a young girl to look like this is wanting her to have sexuality that a 3-year-old should not have. This is a 20-something-year-old. She can flaunt her sexuality any way she wants to. But sexualization of children is never okay. It doesn't really matter what time period we're in. To go off of that, you have gender stereotypes. These are things like where the male is active and the female is passive. Provider, nurturing, sexual subjects as a male and females being the sexual objects. And the male gaze by Laura Mulvey in 1975, where women in the media are viewed from the eyes of the heterosexual man, that these women are represented as passive objects of male desire. You see that, in movies, like almost all movies, to be honest. Children's shows and advertisements like this one. And it's also something that plays into what we mentioned in the hero mythology theory, where Shirley Temple is given very stereotypical female traits of charm, virginal innocence, super positive, needing somebody by the end, not being able to help herself. And the man is given very masculine traits, being wealthy and important and possessive, and he inserts himself into her life, and he is the hero. And it seems to be written for the male gaze. It was written with men in mind. This is what men wanted to see in children, sweet little girls, and this is what men wanted to see men act like at the end. I just think that that's a very interesting thing. And it also plays into Shirley Temple's roles and how people saw her. Graham Greene wrote an infamous review of Shirley Temple's movie Wee Willie Winkie, when he talks a lot about the sexuality placed on Shirley. But one thing that he did say that kind of struck me was that adult emotions of love and grief was sought across the mask of childhood, a childhood skin deep. And what he's kind of referring to is that Shirley appeared to be a child. She had the physical voice of a child, but she had very well developed emotions of love and grief and understanding of using what you have to your advantage and how to charm a man that was really, really blurred, this line between being a child and being an adult. It became this really weird gray area between Shirley sitting on one of her male co-stars' lap in the movie. What is that representing? Is that her being an innocent child? Is that the underlying desires of a man? It's really hard to tell in her movies. And I think that's because in the end, Shirley Temple was a prop that held up the 1930s Depression era audience. Shirley Temple, it wasn't so much about her as a person or even her as a character. It was more about her as an idea, the ideal innocence, the rags to riches, the ideal girl who was cute, sweet, still passive, needed a man. She was just something that the 1930 Depression audience apparently needed, and it was something that Fox Studios molded her into and just tossed her out there as a thing, which, if we look back at feminism, it explores the way that women and men are empowered and disempowered. And Shirley Temple was just sort of made into this thing, whether that was her or not, and placed into the Depression audience to help empower them by disempowering her. And you see it again and again throughout the movies and the media, the same kind of character. She's not an actress, hardly even a person, but a symbol that represents gender stereotypes of virginity and femininity as a male gaze would want to see it, as a male gaze of what is ideally innocent and ideally good in the world. But there's a catch, because it only lasts until puberty, when the symbol no longer carries the same meaning. Shirley Temple, the woman, the real person who grew up, was, I believe, a feminist icon, you know? She became a politician, an advocate. She was an author. She, portrays the idea of feminism. But I do not believe that Shirley Temple, the character, the person that the studios created, was a feminist or was something that I would want my children to look up to or what I would look up to. Because I believe that she was written for men to be this little prop, this little ideal of what an ideal woman should be. And I don't believe that I would call that strength. I think that that's just sort of something that people felt like they needed and that they took from her, even as a young child, and eventually dropped as she became older and more aware of her own self as a person. So thank you very much for listening.